Would you like to build a snowman? If so, then I have the course for you. From our very first model to our final render, we will be applying several non-destructive techniques to provide you the ability to create several iterations of your snowman with ease. Some modeling knowledge is required for this course, however most of the design will be taken care of by using modifiers, such as the displace, skin, and remesh modifiers, as well as several more. We are going to learn how we can offload most of the actual work onto these modifiers, which will free us up to be more involved in rapid art directing. We will also be looking at an easy way to develop fabrics using the cloth filter sculpting tool, which greatly speeds up the cloth workflow. After all of our models are to our satisfaction, we will begin working with entirely procedural materials for each part of our snowman to provide complete flexibility in case we need to make any tweaks or changes. At the close of this course, we will be looking at how we can set up an Eevee render to showcase all of our hard work over the 11 videos in this series. I can't wait to build a snowman together, so make sure to put on your boots and your coat, and I will see you out there. Hey, hi, hello, and welcome to this CG Cookie course. Chances are you probably know what we're going to be making because you saw the thumbnail and the trailer. But if you like to live dangerously and just click on any link that you see, what we're going to be making is this stylized snowman entirely in Blender and learn some pretty cool techniques and tips and tricks along the way that you can use for really any other projects. In this video, we'll take a look at developing the body of the snowman and kind of a cool non-destructive workflow that is going to get us using some different kind of modifiers that you might not use on a regular basis. So let's get into it. So I'm here in my Blender scene, and just for a bit of housekeeping, I've gone ahead and set up a collection here for Snowman. Now it's an empty collection because this is where we're going to add all of the stuff we're doing to build the snowman. And in case there's parts where I maybe go too fast to really see what I'm doing, I've got screencast keys on down here. So it's going to be able to tell you all the button presses and the hotkeys that I'm doing along the way. So the first thing that we're going to need to do for the snowman is develop the body, right? And so this part is really going to be as easy or difficult as we want it to be, because fundamentally, the body is really just 3 spheres stacked on top of each other. But we need to figure out a way to make that look good and not like it's just, 3 spheres stacked on top of each other. So I'll add a sphere in here. And again, I don't really care too much about the resolution or the segments and the rings because we're going to be adding some modifiers to change that and play around with it anyways. So I'll just add that there. And in edit mode, I'm just going to want to bring it up to sit on top of our origin there, just so it's nice and kind of placed right on it. Already off to a great start there. You can see that we've got, pretty much 1/3 done, right? Well, if only it was really that easy. So we could go about it by, Shift D to duplicate, scale it down, and then Shift D to duplicate again and scale it down like that. And, we've already got a okay looking snowman, but that's not very non-destructive, and it really doesn't allow for the easiest of times trying to figure out and maybe reorient or move or position the snowman. So I'm going to go ahead and delete those. And the way that I'm going to do it is going to be a little bit more non-destructive because we're going to house a lot of these operations within modifiers. So the first modifier that I want to add to this sphere is going to be the array modifier so that we can get multiple of these spheres just kind of stacking on top of each other. Right now it's going off in the positive X direction, and that's going to be because of the relative offset. But I actually want to use another object, being an empty, to determine the position and the scale, because by default we're not going to be able to play around with the actual scale of this arrayed or instance mesh here from either the relative or the constant offsets. So I'll go ahead and uncheck that and come down to object offset, and we'll check that one on. So now you can see that we need an object. So I'll quickly just go and add an empty wherever that is, and it doesn't matter what empty you use. I'm just going to use a plain axis. And in the viewport visibility, I'm just going to check in front on so that I can always see where this is, even if it's behind other geometry. So back in our modifier here, I'll go and select this empty. And now if I go ahead and position this empty, right, you can see that this is going to control the location of the arrayed instances of this mesh here. So if I just bring this up to, say, halfway there, and I go ahead and start adding to the count, this is going to allow us to pretty much stack however many we want. And I don't have to do all that work manually. Cool, but okay, they're the same size. So how do we fix that and make them smaller as they go up? Well, that's another perk of using the array with an object offset, because it's going to inherit both the location, if I can select the empty there, the location, right? We can see if I move this around, it inherits the location. It'll inherit the rotation. If I kind of zoom out here, right? We can kind of see that might be useful if we want to bend or warp the snowman. And it's also going to inherit the scale. So if I scale this down, you can see that by the time we get to the top there, it's really, really scaled down in comparison to our starting mesh. So I'll just Control Z that. And I'll bring this down to a count of 3 again, so that we've got kind of the base, the body, and the head. And so now I can go ahead and just start positioning this and scaling it down. And really, there's no scientific scale or size or relationship that you should try and hit here. It's kind of just doing it by eyeball. So something like that looks good for now, but we'll probably change it as we go along. And finally, the last thing I want to do for our initial sphere here is I just want to go into edit mode, select this bottom vertex there, or vertex I should say, and with proportional editing on, I'm just going to kind of flatten that out a little bit so that it kind of just sits a little bit more snugly like that. So now with this selected and our empty, I'm just going to bring it all down like that. And then I'll just quickly go ahead and apply this location and bring this back up just because that kind of played around with that there. Cool. Awesome. So we've got our snowman all figured out using this object array here. We can see that if I want to, rotate it a little bit, it's going to update like that, which is pretty handy if we wanted to try and parent some items to it and just very easily position the snowman in maybe kind of like a silly or cheery pose. The next thing I want to look at is going to be just kind of the intersections of these spheres here, because remember, we've just arrayed 3 spheres, but if we take a look, we can see that there are 3 intersecting spheres. And I want these to all be pretty much one mesh together, because when we go and start, using some displacements on it, it's going to be kind of weird having some displacements on the geometry, but then there's going to be these very sharp cuts. And we're also going to be displacing the geometry with inside other geometry. It's just going to be a mess, trust me. But how can we go about kind of merging all of these, getting rid of the interior intersections, and making this all pretty much non-destructive, right? Well, we actually have a modifier to do all 3 of those. And the modifier I'm going to use is going to be the remesh modifier. So when I add that, you can see that it's pretty much just connected or joined these spheres together. And in our transparency here, you can see that there's no interior intersections. They're all gone. So it's pretty much crossed all of those issues that I've just talked about off the list. And what's really cool is that I can go back into edit mode, maybe select a few vertices and bring them out. And when I come back into our object mode, it's actually updated accordingly for our mesh here. So that's really, really cool. And that's why I really like working with modifiers, because it makes a lot of our work non-committal. So if I realized, oh shoot, I messed up, all I have to do, just come in, get rid of the modifier, and I'm back to where I started, or back to where I was before I made the mistake. So I'll quickly go and re-add that there. So now that we've got that figured out and we know what it does, how can we optimize it and actually make it look good? Because, this doesn't look amazing. Well, we have a bunch of different types that we can do for our remeshing, right? So from left to right, we've got blocks, which is going to pretty much do exactly what it says, right? And remesh it as blocks. And actually that is a good segue into just adding some cavities so we can see things a little bit nicer. We've got our blocks there. We've also got smooth, and smooth is going to be okay, right? If we increase the octave tree there, right, we're going to get something a little bit nicer, but still doesn't look too great at the intersections, and it doesn't actually account for the intersecting geometry. So that's going to be a no-go. We can do sharp, but you can see that, right, this is also going to not account for those intersecting pieces there. So that's also going to be a no-go. So we'll come back to voxel, which it was on by default, and we can see that it is actually going to get rid of that. So voxel is going to be the one that we're going to want to stay on. We also have this voxel size, so we can increase or decrease the voxel size. Increasing it means that we're going to have basically larger voxels or faces, so it's going to be less dense or less resolution, right? So if I bump this up to something like 0.2, you can see that that's going to look even worse. So for higher resolution, we actually want to go lower on the voxel size. So in my studying, I found that something like 0.02 meters was something that's pretty good, right? We can see that it doesn't have any issues on the interior. It's pretty round overall for the shapes there, and we're going to get some nice smoothing in the intersections there. And we can go ahead and just turn smooth shading on for that. And finally, what adaptivity is going to do is just kind of help you further smooth out some faces, but I found that it really gives a lot of kind of artifacts and triangulation. If we take a look, right, what it's doing is trying to optimize your mesh by kind of triangulating or decimating it and only leaving the areas that kind of need more geometry, which is going to be these intersections here. But it kind of makes it look a little bit, well, we'll say not good. I think that's a polite way to say it. So I'm just going to bring this back down to 0. And we'll use another modifier to really smooth out the surface of the snowman. Because right now we've got a lot of these kind of straight, very rigid faces, which aren't conducive to a snowman. So the modifier that we're going to use to smooth out the faces or the surface of the snowman has a pretty self-explanatory name, actually. So if we take a look at the modifiers and come down to smooth, right? Kind of a dead giveaway, hopefully, on what it's going to do. And it's going to smooth the mesh by flattening the angles between adjacent faces. So that just means it's going to try and smooth everything out. So we can select that one. And when we come into the actual modifier, it's a little bit less intuitive as to what it's actually doing. Let's talk about it. The first one is axis. So we can actually give a specific axis or multiple axes that we want to smooth on, so it doesn't actually smooth from every angle. We've also got the factor here, which is basically going to be the overall strength of the smoothing that this modifier is going to do. And finally, we've got the repeat, which is basically just going to be how many samples we want to give the strength of the smoothing. So you can see that as I bring the factor up, it's going to smooth everything out just, a little bit to the point where it actually kind of adds a little bit of artifacts. But if I go and then add another repeat, you can see that it's kind of just amplified or multiplied the factor that we have here. So I found that the smooth modifier is really kind of a balancing act between finding that thin line of what is good but not overdone. So for this particular model, I found that a factor of something like 3.5 with a repeat of 2 is probably going to give us the most bang for our buck. And if we take a look without the modifier on, right, a little bit more faceted faces, and with the modifier on, a little bit smoother. So now we can still see some of those faces, but once we add some displacement to the actual mesh, it's really not going to be noticeable anymore. So let's now add a displacement modifier, right? Because I've really been kind of hyping it up for this video. So under modifiers and deform, we'll go and add a displace. And this is going to allow us to get some kind of nice procedural noise. Now, this is not really the procedural noise that I was looking for here. So let's just go ahead and quickly add a new texture. And let's call this bumps. And I'm going to do underscore large. And the reason I'm going to do large is because I'm going to want to use multiple displacement modifiers to kind of have a layering of geometry displacement going on. I don't really want one modifier to control all of the kind of nuances of my mesh here. I'll also come and just name this modifier here large, so that we know which modifier this actually is when we go around and start playing with this texture here. So I'll quickly just bring our strength down to something like 0.1. And once I'm satisfied with that, I'll actually come into our texture properties here. And this is where we're going to be able to play around with the procedural texture. So we can see that we're playing around with the large modifier. And right now, the large modifier is using the bumps large texture, which is, for all intents and purposes, black. So let's go ahead and change that to be clouds. So now we're going to have this clouds texture driving the displacement modifier right here. So if I play around with the intensity, right, we can get some interesting results. And I'll just bring that back to 0.1. But we aren't limited to playing around with the texture just here. In our texture properties, we actually have some extra information that's going to allow us to kind of define the texture on a more detail-oriented level. And so because this is our large bumps, I don't want the scale or the size of this texture to be too small, because this is giving us a lot of more smaller detail. So I'm going to just drag this up to something like 1 to give it just a more larger or broader shape, right? So we can see that it's not doing too much surface information, but it's just kind of obscuring the overall mesh just a little bit. We can also go ahead and play around with the different noises if we want to kind of change that shape up. It's really up to you and whatever you want, whatever you think looks good. Okay, so we're satisfied with our large information, but it doesn't look too cool. Let's take a look at the smaller information because that looks just infinitely better, right? So back in our modifiers, I'll come down and with my mouse hovering over this displacement modifier, I'm going to hit Shift D, and that's actually going to duplicate that displacement modifier. So I'll quickly go ahead and name this one small. And I'll just go and you can see that it's using this bumps large too. So if we were to play around with the bumps large texture, it would actually be in both of these displacements. So we need to create a new texture specific for the small modifier. So I'm just going to click this little 2 here. And I'll go ahead and rename this to bumps small. And now when I come into texture properties, right now we're still working with the large displacement and the bumps large texture. And I'm going to go and select small. And that's why we wanted to name these, just so we know which modifier and which texture we're actually working on. So now that I've got bump small there, we can go ahead and play around with the size. So I'm going to bring that back down. And I'm thinking maybe something around 0.35. And the really cool thing is that it's also still using, obviously, the displacement from our first modifier here. So this is why I like to kind of stack that displacement so that we can add really cool effects as almost like layers. So that's going to conclude all the work we're going to do in this video. And I'd say we have a pretty good looking base mesh to start working off of. Let's take this minute to just kind of recap what we've done because we covered a lot of ground with only a few modifiers and probably some you haven't really touched in too much depth in your own work. So we started off by arraying this sphere here using an empty to allow us to alter the location, the scale, and finally the rotation, all by manipulating this empty object. We also went ahead and remeshed our object together so that we aren't getting any intersections in our geometry, and we're getting some nice smoothing at the intersections of our spheres here. We also went ahead and smoothed the surface a little bit just to try and get rid of that more grid-like structure that we got from the faces of these spheres. And finally, we went ahead and added some variation to the surface of the geometry to give it a nice looking kind of snowy texture to it, right? And the best part about all of this is that it's completely non-destructive. So I can come back into edit mode here, move my vertices around just a little bit if I wanted to, and it's going to update my mesh accordingly as if nothing was ever different in our initial model.